Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing another Sharks player review, and finally we have a player who actually remains with the San Jose Sharks going into the next season after having reviewed Burns, Dahlin, and Balcers, who are no longer with the organization. And today we have defenseman Mario Ferraro. He just recently signed a four-year deal worth $3.25 million per year, and it seemed as though if you had asked me last season that he had signed that deal, I would have thought that was extremely cheap for Ferraro, and I do sort of still believe that, but it makes a lot more sense in the context of this past season because it was a bit of a letdown in my opinion compared to where he left off in the previous year, 2021. But let's first start with the history of Mario Ferraro with the San Jose Sharks. Not a particularly extensive history, as he's still a pretty young player. Was drafted in the second round of the 2017 draft, spent a couple of years in university before making a transition to the Sharks main squad in the 1920 season. Now, he wasn't given a massive role during that year, but he still did get a pretty decent amount of minutes, just about 16 minutes of time on ice per game over the 50 or 60 games that he actually ended up playing. So he was pretty consistently a third pairing guy who could get like a bit more time on ice than you would expect from the normal type of third pairing guy, which made the transition to the next season quite surprising because by 2021, just a year after, he found himself on the top pairing with Brent Burns over 22 minutes of time on ice per game. Pretty insane transition, and Ferraro grew into that role amazingly. He really looked like he had the pieces to become a solid top pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks that year and into the future. It looked like this was going to be a great stepping stone season to really bring that fact home in, the next year and the following years after that. But this past season, with hopes pretty high, it didn't really end up happening. If anything, he stagnated and potentially even took a small step backwards. Mario Ferraro was looking like a solid top pairing defenseman last season. This year, he was still okay, but maybe more so in a top four kind of role, I felt like, which you could say met preseason expectations if you were keeping them realistic. But like I mentioned, preseason hopes was that he would continue to develop, and he didn't really do so much. Now, how exactly did that happen? Well, it wasn't necessarily because of his effort. In fact, you could maybe argue that his effort was the reason, but for a completely different reason. You see, Mario Ferraro has pretty much the cliche, I guess you could say, of he puts his heart on the line every single night. And this is said about so many NHL players, even when it's not exactly true. It's just something that you normally say to try and say, oh, he really cares about the game. Now, all of these players do care about the game, but it's rare that they're giving it their 100 every single night. I'm not going to name any names, but there are certainly players on the San Jose Sharks who in, many preseason games will go 70% or 80% because they don't want to put that full 100, while Mario Ferraro every single night is giving his 110% to try and get the Sharks the lead and then the victory. He has, he leads the team in blocked shots. He takes a ton of hits. He dishes out a ton of hits. He really lays his body on the line for the San Jose Sharks, and like I mentioned, this might be a reason for why he slightly regressed this past season, because it's extremely difficult to do that over a full 82 game stretch. The reason why these players don't give it their 100 every single game, because it begins to wear on you. An 82 game regular season over just a 5 or 6 month span is incredibly packed together. You're very tightly packed. You have a lot of travel in between. There isn't necessarily a ton of time for rest, and it is extremely grueling to play just a single hockey game, and especially when you're trying to necessarily prepare for the playoffs where the game gets turned up to 11 and it's even more physical. It's difficult to actually give your 100 every single night, and Ferraro is trying to do that. Now, I'm not trying to sit here and say, oh, Ferraro needs to stop trying so hard. That's a bit awkward, but he needs to find himself in a rhythm where he doesn't get so physically and, most importantly, mentally fatigued, because he was making a lot of very uncharacteristic errors this past season compared to the previous one, where he was just having these really awful giveaways in the defensive zone that were kind of so difficult to explain that you could only really chalk it up to that mental fatigue aspect. But now moving into how he actually performed this season points-wise, 63 games, 2 goals, 12 assists for 14 points. Now, it is extremely easy to look at these numbers. First of all, I should say over a full 82-game season, that's about 21, 22 points. It's very easy to look at these numbers and say, well, Ferraro is much more of a defensive defenseman, so it is pretty okay. And that's definitely true if you're hoping for Mario Ferraro to just become like a second-pairing guy who plays like a lot of shorthanded time. Then putting up 22 points in a particular season is perfectly fine. But if you do have the hopes that Mario Ferraro could become a top pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks at some point in the future, you do need to see these point totals jump up, at least honestly by a decent amount. I'm not saying he needs to be Roman Josi or Cale Makar and suddenly start putting up point per game seasons, but let's take a look at a player like Jacob Slavin on the Carolina Hurricanes, widely regarded as one of the best defensemen in the NHL, extremely solid defensively, which is what you're hoping Mario Ferraro to become. But because he is still that number one guy for Carolina, he still managed to put up about 42 points this past season. Not game-breaking, not Norris Trophy winning, not 90 points like Roman Josi is getting, but certainly enough to call himself the number one defenseman on that team. Mario Ferraro, no matter how fantastic defensively you are, with 22 points, you're not necessarily going to be looked at as the guy for the San Jose Sharks. Even about a decade ago when Mark-Edvard Vlasic was, on all accounts, the best defensive defenseman, not just on the Sharks, but in the entire league, he wasn't necessarily given that close of a look by many of the more casual fans around the league because of the fact that he wasn't necessarily putting up a ton of points. And even then, Vlasic, for defensemen, actually had decent point totals. So Ferraro being here at 22 at a time where defensemen are putting up pretty easily 50, 60 plus types of points, you're hoping that those point totals can go up. Maybe you could argue that Brent Burns being such a puck hog, which he definitely was, kind of took away a bit of points from Mario Ferraro, but then you also have to turn it the other way and say, well, Burns also made a lot happen on the ice, put in a lot of goals with his effort, and Mario Ferraro should have also benefited from that and picked up a few assists or secondary assists here or there, and he didn't necessarily do that. When it comes to plus minus, minus five is actually pretty decent for a top pairing defenseman on a pretty bad team, and you'll look at this and you'll say, well, look, Brent Burns had such a much more terrible plus minus. Does this mean that Brent Burns was just completely dragging down Mario Ferraro? Well, we do also have to note that one of the biggest deflators of plus minus in the entire league is 6-on-5 play, of which the Sharks participated in a lot this season. In terms of empty net goals, the Sharks scored 6, but they gave up 23, which was the 4th most in the entire league, which means that Brent Burns, who was on for pretty much every single 6-on-5 situation for the San Jose Sharks, obviously, he pretty much gets a free minus 17 just because of that, at no fault to him. So since Mario Ferraro is pretty much never in these types of situations, because the other defenseman here on the ice is usually Erik Karlsson, Ferraro doesn't have that massive deflating thing bringing his plus minus downward. So I wouldn't say that this is some sort of indication that Brent Burns completely dragged down Ferraro, but it is still good news that Ferraro's plus minus was still relatively solid. And then when it comes to his time on ice, 23 minutes on the dot here for Mario Ferraro. He was second on the team in terms of time on ice at even strength, as well as second on the team in terms of time on ice at shorthanded. The major thing was that Ferraro doesn't really get much power play time, which you could also argue is a reason for why his point totals are slightly lower. The fact is that the Sharks had both Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. There's never really that much of a great time to get Ferraro in. He still had about 30 seconds of power play ice time per game, so not awful, though not particularly great either. It's just that he doesn't really fit into that particular role at this point of his career. And so to recap, Mario Ferraro, it was not a completely awful season. I'm not terribly disappointed in exactly what he did. And like I said, he kind of met my very safe preseason expectations of him still being a serviceable top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. But the fact is that many Sharks fans, including myself, were hopeful that he'd take another step forward and really cement himself as a top 2 defenseman on the San Jose Sharks. And that just didn't really happen. And as such, I give him the grade of a C. Class dismissed.